Hi, my name's Penny. Welcome to Module 3. This is our first video in our series. So our topic this week is all about risk, the return and the time value of money. So what you're going to be learning this week is what is the concept of return, what are the forces that affect the level of return. You should be able to explain the role of the time value of money in measuring return, distinguish between the real, risk-free and required returns, be able to calculate and apply the holding period return yield and growth rates, explain the concept and calculate yield, identify key sources of risk that may affect the investment vehicles, and understand the risk of a single asset risk assessment, the steps that combine risk. So we discussed in Module 1 what we wanted from our investment, and we wanted a return. This return is made up of two parts. One, income. So depending on what type of investment, if it's shares, they'd give you dividends, you may get distributions. If it was property, they'd be giving you rent. Bank account could give you interest. So it's the same concept, it's just depending on what the investment is you've chosen, they've just got a slightly different name for the income. So your investment may give you income, it may not. It will either give you income or a capital gain, or perhaps both. So capital gains, or sadly losses, that's the difference between what you pay for your investment and what you receive at the end when you sell it. So you buy it for $100, you sell it for $120, you've got a capital gain of $20. But if you sell it for $90 when you'd bought it for $100, well, there's a loss of $10. So the total return that you've made on your investment, we add up the income and we add the capital gain, or if there's a loss, you'd have to subtract it. So that's the total of your return. We could express this in dollars. It's more common to talk about it as a percentage so that you can compare it to your other investments. So why is this important? Well, I just touched on that. You want to be able to compare your investment to your other investments, what you're expecting. So it helps us to keep score of how our investments are going compared to what our expectations are. Now, when we purchased the investment, we would have looked at the historical performance. So what did this investment do in the past? And that helps us have an idea of what to expect, the performance of the investment in the future. There's no guarantee though, it's just a guide. So we have our expected return. So this is what we believe that the investment is going to earn in the future. So that determines what the investor is willing to pay for the investment, or if they're willing to even make that investment. So it helps to make the investment decision, the expected return. So what can influence returns? Well, think about the individual investment and what are its internal characteristics. So what is the type of the investment or risk? Think about a term deposit. So that type would be cash. What's the risk? Very low risk with a bank. What's the issuer's management? Well, if you're going with one of the main banks, you'd be fairly confident that it's managed well. And what's the issuer's financing that they're using behind the scenes? So those are the internal characteristics. But then we've got external forces. What's going on with politics, business environment, the economy, and inflation and deflation. Well, look back on 2020 as a good example. You know, everything seemed fine, and then bam, we had COVID. We then went into a recession, fortunately only for 2 quarters, and then came out. We had a huge problem with our economy, our businesses, inflation. Oh, the inflation, I think, was still ticking along in that time. A lot of things can influence the returns on the investments. Yeah, a bit of maths. There's going to be a bit of maths this week, but we've got to figure out how to actually measure our return. So we'll use a formula for this. So what return do you require from investment J? So from investment J, the return that we require is made up of 3 different parts. The real rate of return plus the expected inflation premium plus a risk premium for investment J. So that's related to more about what investment J is. Let's look at the first part of this equation, real rate of return. So what's the rate of return? In the perfect world, there's no uncertainty, so there's no risk. So it is the nominal rate of return minus the inflation rate. Measures the change in purchasing power provided by an investment. And the expected inflation premium, what are we expecting inflation to do, the average rate in the future? Then the third part is the risk premium, but we're going to focus on just these first 2 sections of the formula first. So the real rate of return plus the expected inflation premium. So if we take those two, the real rate of return plus the expected inflation premium, we actually call this the risk-free rate. What do we use to represent the risk-free rate? Well, here we've got the Australian Treasury bonds. So these are our government bonds. They're considered to be extremely low risk. So we would use that rate for our risk-free rate. So if we're shortening this down to write it, we're going to write R with a capital F. That's our risk-free rate. And it is our real rate of return, R with the asterisk, plus IP, which is the expected inflation premium. So the risk-free rate is the first 2 parts of the formula we looked at on the previous page, which is the formula for required return. Okay, so the third part of the formula was the risk premium. That formula was talking about what's the risk premium for J. So this is the extra part of the return that the investor requires based on the risks of that actual investment. So the risks based on the issue and the issuer characteristics. So the issue characteristic, what type of investment is this? What's the maturity, so the time it will take to get your return? What are the features of this investment? And issuer characteristics, well, which industry is it in? Are there factors for the company that we need to consider? So it's the extra compensation that we require for taking the risk. So this is a summarized formula now. Required return, R, the required return on J, so we've got R with a little j, is made up of the risk-free rate, R with the capital F, plus the risk premium for J. So this is a simplified formula on what we first see, because remember that risk-free rate is made up of the real rate of return plus the inflation. Now we've seen this graph here before. Let's have another look at it. So across the bottom, we've got our risk. So starting off with no risk through to very high risk. Then up here is our return. Now this bottom section is the risk-free return. So that's made up of our real return plus our inflation premium, IP. Once you get above this risk-free level, we've then got the part in red. So this is the actual part, the compensation that we required based on that specific investment that we're buying, the risk premium for J. So we don't know what J is, but if J was something quite low risk, well, let's say back here on 0, it was buying government bonds. So it'd be down here, cash in the term deposits. And as we move up, perhaps we're buying some Australian shares now, we've got this section here. That is the risk premium for J, or perhaps J is some venture capital for which we would expect a much larger amount. We also have seen this graph before. So very low cash in the bank, moving up real estate, along shares, and then venture capital, far side. So depending on what your investment is, that's how much you would require for the risk premium. The more risk it is, we would expect to get a much higher return. This picture here is giving us an example of variability. It's quite interesting how things have changed. So down the bottom, we've got now the pink is cash. So you tend to think of cash being down the bottom all the time, but actually it's not entirely true. So we had international equity in 2009, 2010, negative performance, small capitalization, so small companies. We've also featured very heavily as being down the bottom, the biggest return, the worst return in those years. And actually the pink cash has been, in 2018, was quite a high return. So you can really see how things are jumping around, like what's at the top. Well, small capitalization was down the bottom and then it's shot up to the top. So there's quite a range of results that you could get for your different investments. Let's do a practice question now. So we had our formula and we'll have a go at using it. So based on his assessment of the risk of investing in BHP shares, Fred requires a total investment return of 12%. The current risk-free rate is 4.5% and inflation is expected to be 2.5% over the long term. So we're being asked to find two things. What is the risk premium for the BHP shares and what is the expected real rate of return? Okay, the required return for BHP, we've got the risk-free rate plus the risk premium for BHP. Now we're trying to find out in A, what is the risk premium? So we'll have to rearrange our formula. Remember, what you do to one side, you do to the other. So I've got here, I'll have to subtract this from this side over to there. So I'm just swapped it around to the make it on the left. So the risk premium for BHP is going to equal the return for BHP minus the risk-free rate. Okay, see if you can figure that out. Maybe pause so I don't have to keep it quiet for a bit longer. Okay, so pause and have a go at that. You're going to have to put in the details and work it out. Let's have a look at B. B is asking us what is the expected real rate of return. So we know the risk-free rate is made up of the real rate of return plus inflation. Okay, so we know the inflation is 2.5%. Do you know any of these other pieces of information? Do you know the risk-free rate? Sorry, no. So we have to rearrange the equation. We're trying to work out the expected real rate of return. Risk-free rate minus the inflation will tell you what the real rate of return is. So pause there and see if you can work it out. Let's go and have a look at the answers. Oh, I should put that first. Okay, required return for BHP. So we know that Fred requires a total investment return of 12%. So his investment return for BHP is 12%. The current risk-free rate is 4.5%. So from that, we can then work out what is the risk premium that he's putting on the BHP shares. So that's 7.5%. You work that out by taking the 12% minus the 4.5%. Let's look at B. What's the expected real rate of return? So the risk-free rate, got the risk-free amount equals the real rate plus the inflation premium. Rearrange it so that we can find out what the real rate of return is. Okay, so we know that the risk-free rate is 4.5% and the inflation is expected to be 2.5%. So subtract the inflation and then we've worked out that the expected real rate of return is 2%. Okay, I'll have a practice of that and then we'll do some more in class.